Okay, go by your heads. And here's fellowship today. Lord, thank you for bringing us all together. We thank you for the past week and all the blessings that we received, all the words, all the encouragement, and all the ups and downs of this past week. That we are now here gathered today to once again your word to get what we need to get out of it today. That you would be with us, that you would hold us, Lord, in your hand as we search through all of the words that you speak to us. We ask, Lord, that you take care of those who cannot be here, and thank you for those who are here today. And that those who could not be here, Lord, that you would be with them, and that they will worship and read your word, Lord, and we pray, Lord, that guide us in our service and allow us to be home. Amen. Amen.
Okay, so we're going to do a quick recap of what we've done, as we always do, just to make sure that we didn't forget everything from week to week. And before we begin, we just want to say that we're starting in chapter 20, but we want to hear about some of the key points of last week. And one thing I did want to notice, chapters 18, 19, and 20 are all about sin. And they have to deal with this sin before Isaac can be born. We'll talk about that a little more clearly in a few minutes, but this had to be addressed simply because they were about to have Isaac, and there could be no question of his parentage. Everything had to be settled and decided upon by then. So just a little heads up. We start with an overview of the Bible from an old slide out of a previous recording, and Genesis 1-3 deal with the creation and the fall of man. 4-11 are the prehistorical period. It talks about the Tower of Babel. And remember, Abraham was raised about 120 miles from Babylon. So it's likely that he knew at least some of the characters or some of the things that occurred in that time period. He was not raised in a godly or believing family. It says more than one time that he was taken out of the other side of Euphrates from an idol-worshiping family, a family who was serving a different god. Gives us a little bit of context. So then we move on into chapters 20-50, and those are about the patriarchs, really who you know. Let's look at it this way. Maybe this will help a little bit as well. There's Genesis 1 and 2, obviously, are the creation. 3 and 4 are the fall of man, Cain and Abel, and then we have Noah's genealogy, chapter 5, the Tower of Babel, and that's 10-11, and then Abraham is 12-20, and Isaac is 21-26, excuse me. And then Joseph is 27. I am just 27 through. Okay, guys, my apologies for the stumbling on that last slide. We wound up with the the audio on the previous recording we did during class completely destroyed itself. So I was trying to dub in 2 or 3 different things at one time. I'm going to go ahead and continue. That the Tower of Babel was 10 and 11, and then Abraham was 12-20. Isaac's discussions about his life are 21-26. Then we talk about Jacob, 27-36, and Joseph, 37-50. This helps you a lot be able to understand the Bible and the layout. You can frequently just return to this and get some context of what happened and how long all these things took. And anyway, so we're going to continue on with this. In a little bit, we're going to expand out the 12-20 so you can understand those chapters. The call of Abraham, and the call of Abraham was particularly important because it includes, after a call, there's always obedience before he gives you more revelation. It's pretty important. It's important in our own lives. And the example I gave last week was that I had been talking about we'd all been excited about doing service work within the community. And that particular circumstance just couldn't quite work. I tried something and it wasn't going to happen. But I wanted it to, and you guys wanted it to. We kept not quite finding the right thing. I was on the phone with Marge the other day, and in the middle of the conversation, I was like, I got it. No, I got it. And it hit me when she was talking about, the various charities or various organizations that we wanted to support. That some of them were very different links in driving. It was a little bit difficult. So while we're talking, I remembered that there's a wonderful food bank on south of us on Farm Road 1826, and it would be a great one for us to partner with. So I was pretty excited. And I've had the call that as a group we need to do this. I had a step of obedience that we need to take this action. And the next day I was on the phone with Lisa, and she brought up that there was, or we were talking, and she brought up that the neighborhood Facebook page had a call for donations to that same food bank. And how perfect. We bring our donations in next Monday. We or have them picked up at Lisa's house and they go to that same food bank that we were talking about. That's just the example of once you obey, he reveals the next step, but he frequently won't reveal the next step until you obey. So I was excited about it, and I think it's gonna be a great situation for all of us. But it is a perfect example for this particular type of studying that we're doing right now. It's a pretty consistent relationship: call, obedience, and revelation. Then we have the conversation in the next chapter, 13, about the separation of Lot. God told him to leave everyone behind, all of his family, and take off. We'll find out, and before he did, he had a conversation with Sarah that we'll refer to later. But he was told to do that, and he didn't. He took Lot with him. We will never know what Lot's outcome would have been if Abraham had left him behind like he was told to, or if he hadn't have gone into Egypt and Lot potentially was exposed to the world and some wickedness within it. We don't know those things. All we know is that the separation of Lot occurred, and after that happened, God gave the next level of revelation to Abraham. Then the next chapter is the battle of the 9 kings, where the five, rebel against the 4, and Abraham has to go rescue Lot. And in that process, the king of Sodom offers him a lot of money, and he winds up not taking it. Then we talk about Hagar the Egyptian, her whole first time she goes out into the desert, and the trauma of that whole situation with Ishmael being conceived. After that, the next chapter is the names, and the covenant is actually given. The full covenant is given to Abraham, and a wonderful, mysterious thing that indicates that God gave it to Abraham, and Abraham did not do the natural second half of covenant making. In other words, they did a figure eight, and normally when you made a covenant, one party did one side, one party did the other. But in this situation, God did his part, but Abraham was asleep for it, so he could not fulfill anything on his own power. It was simply a matter of God saying, "This is what I will do." The following chapter is the Oaks of Mamre, and I chose to call it Oaks because oaks are similar, or terebinths are similar to our oaks as we know about it, and terebinth trees just, you have no idea what that looks like, and I thought it would help give a good visual. Then we followed up with Sodom and Gomorrah, understanding that Lot wouldn't have made some of the choices that he made if he had not already given into the greediness of his own heart. When he had opportunity to pick the land he wanted earlier, Abraham let him select. He picked the finest and the best. He picked the land close to Sodom. Then later he turns his tent toward Sodom. Then he moves into Sodom and sits at the city gates as a form of responsibility or control. Now today we're going to finish up with Abraham being the focus about talking about Gerar, but I want to make one more comment about Sodom that we talked about, or about Lot. And one of the things about Lot that is particularly interesting is that it represents our heart. We all know that we're saved, but we all know that we allow sin, or we live with some sin in our life and not putting it to death. There are no stories at all of Lot preaching or witnessing about the God who delivered them from Egypt and all the way up to this point. We just simply know that I don't know how to say it. He just simply went ahead and did what he wanted to do and gave into his heart. And that was the key portion of why what the whole point of Sodom and Gomorrah. But as we know, a lot of things happened. We saw a lot of flaws. We've seen Adam's flaws. We've seen Abraham's flaws. We've seen Noah's flaws. That's the healthy thing about what God has done for us. He's let us know. We know that we still sing David's songs and Solomon's, and he's clear about our sins. There's nothing impossible. They isn't say anything negative, but there's something very, very important about those sins and how we need to deal with them. All right. Now let's talk about looking ahead after today. 12 through 20 is Abraham. On 21, we jump off into talking about Isaac, his birth, and his life. Then 27 through 36, the focus goes to Jacob, and 37 to 50 is Joseph. Did I say Joseph? I should have said Jacob. And then to 37 to 50 is Joseph. Just a little fun fact. All of those stories I was telling you about David and Solomon and Noah, Peter, Adam, all of these, we hear all types of stories about things they did right and wrong. But Joseph and Daniel were two men in the Bible that had nothing bad ever written about them. It's kind of interesting that those are two big characters. Now, there's some others that not much is said about, but we get into these big stories, and Joseph had a lot of opportunity, and yet nothing was said, and so was Daniel. Just a little interesting fact. Obviously, Jesus didn't either. There's just something to think about. Now, just reviewing chapter 19, we want to look at that and see that that's first through third verse was Lot convincing the two angelic visitors to stay with him, not out in the city square. Then the men of the city's wickedness was displayed. Lot offers his daughters. Wow. Okay. We talked a little bit about that. He had not raised them in faith. Women, and there were several things. Culturally, there were some things about women that were not as important at that time, but he offered them to protect the angels. Part of that was also cultural. It was considered a almost beyond reason that we would allow someone that was under our guarding, our home, to be injured or to be hurt. Of course, obviously, that does not supersede how we feel about our daughters. But the warning is given to Lot, and he warns his family. And then what just happened? He grabbed him by the wrist. Oh, by the way, his family, the son-in-law thought he was jesting. They disappeared. They didn't go with him. He had spoken so little about his faith that they didn't take him seriously at all when he was giving them the warning. That's a little bit sad. It's also not totally surprising. But continuing on, what just happened? Well, it's kind of all of a sudden they're talking. Now, let's get a picture of what this town looked like. There's major confusion. The men of the community have become blind. It's a few hours later. You think there isn't at least noise and people wandering around the streets trying to figure out what happened? But they completely went from that place where the angels grabbed their hands or wrists, and then they were outside the city. That's what God does for us. He completely takes us out of the situation where we are not distressed and we're actually interfered with fulfilling his will. But also, many people use this as a type and a shadow, the rapture. There won't be thinking about it, trying to find your way about it, looking it up. All of a sudden, you're there and you're not. Then they had the escape to Zoar. Now, the escape to Zoar was caught with a lot of things. First off, he argues with the angel about where they were supposed to go. He wanted to go to the mountains. But nonetheless, he goes to Zoar, and then later he winds up going to the mountains. Then we hear about the judgment falling. Abraham seeing the smoke. Then they moved out of Zoar to the mountains, and for some reason, the women thought there were no other children available. There were no other men available. There was full destruction. Now, if they were in Zoar, that doesn't totally make sense to us, unless they saw someone. We had that conversation last week that perhaps they saw destruction that we didn't quite understand. But at any rate, they wind up having sex with their dad, and Moab and Ben-Ami are born, and he later become the Moabites and the Ammonites, and those those are the two that really plagued Israel for quite a bit of the rest of their history. Looking at Lot, you can't say that he survived a good life. He wound up losing everything he owned. He has two daughters. He had incestuous children. He was drunk. He's living in a cave, and he's no longer living in that beautiful city of Sodom, or no longer anywhere near Abraham's protection. So you can't say Lot got out of it with no repercussions. He lost a lot by not choosing to put to death the things in our flesh that we do. And you say, well, what does that mean? I'm going anger, disappointment, hurt. You set them aside and you ask God to heal your heart, but you don't continue to live in sin. You don't continue to compromise your I don't know how to say it, to compromise your witness and your faith to others. That's a classic type thing that we will see is when we give in, it gets easier and easier to give in. And that's really the story of this whole process here of what has happened. Now we are going to just briefly talk about the scriptures that we had looked at. it was done because in Ezekiel 16:49, this was the sin of the sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and needy. And it goes on to the detestable things they had done, and that Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding towns gave themselves up to the sexual immorality and perversion. The real caveat is, and it goes on, says the real caveat is that they just simply accepted it. That was the primary reason for it. Now, going to the next slide, we see that the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of the people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Now, here's the second thing I wanted to point out to you. It's just Romans 1. Since what may be known about God is plain to them because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. There's no way that we can say we've never heard about God. He clearly tells us that it has been made plain to us since the creation of the world, and there is no excuse, no matter what country, what continent, what home life you've had growing up. He tells us that he holds us accountable to being able to recognize that God is here. Now, looking at that, it's a little bit sobering. He goes on and he says, for although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being in birds and animals and reptiles. Now, here is the one that's just a little bit kind of take you over. Because they did that, this is what that therefore means. Because they did that, God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever to be praised. Amen. Now that speaks for itself. He will give you over to your sin if you continue on in it. If you completely give yourself, you got given over because you did not glorify him or give thanks for who he is. So continuing on, because of this, God gave them over to shameful lust. Even their women exchanged natural relations for the unnatural ones. In the same way that men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men continued shameful acts with men and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. Furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so God gave them over to a depraved mind. So they do what ought not to be done. They became filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, and no mercy. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do those things, but they approve of those who practice them. Now, there's a principle in the Bible, old and new, that the sin is bad, but when we approve of those who practice those sinful things, we are also accountable and responsible. I'll give you an example. If one of you were having an affair with your husband, God tells me in the New Testament to love you, to pray for you, and with love, restore you to the faith. You don't turn your back on God or his laws because we love you so much. That's actually hurtful to you to allow you to continue on into your sin. But you don't do it by beating them in the head with the Bible. You do it with love and graciousness because the goal is not to set them straight. The goal is to restore them back into the relationship with Christ. At any rate, there are many people who believe that homosexuality wasn't really the sin. The sin was the acceptance of all the sin going on around them. And it became, exalted in, enjoyed, laughed at. I really don't know exactly the words you want to use, but it is the fact that they just accepted it and there was no one saying, no, that's wrong. And there was not anyone calling out and preaching to them, especially Lot, which is a little bit disappointing. Now, this is a very difficult situation. Many of us have family members who are in sin. It is hard to bring it up. It's hard to talk about it. You don't want to cause rebellion in their hearts. And at the same time, you don't want to allow them to continue to be destroyed. But you pray about it first, that He will open their ears to hear and their hearts to know. It's extremely important that they understand what's going on. We don't just, is it suiting us to straighten them out? In the meantime, are we full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, or malice? Are we gossiping? Are we arrogant or boastful? Are we slanderers? We have to really, as he says, get the mote out of our own eye before we work on the beam in someone else's. So continuing on, the question is, how does this apply to us? What can we do? And how did those chapters really connect to you? And excuse me, one of the things they apply to us is the idea of dying daily, of being crucified with Christ, of laying down, of resting, and of depending on Him totally, and letting go of your own sin nature and the desires that you have, and asking to live with God as He asked you to. Paul said he didn't even want to judge his own heart, but he also said he presses to the high prize of the calling. He wanted to be a part of a holy nation. Peter says we are already in that holy nation. You already have citizenships with a different group of people than your own country. You're not really responsible for the leadership. The responsibility level you have is, are you praying for them? Are you witnessing to others? But once they're in their job and they're elected, I mean, you do your part, you vote, you talk. I'm not saying that. But once they're elected, you understand God gives us the leadership that we deserve. He gives us the leadership. It represents our own hearts. He said the hands of the king are in the heart of the Lord. He clearly caused Pharaoh and Herod to do things that would create his purpose. Because if our hearts are wicked, as it just said in that previous slide, our leadership will be wicked because it reflects us. So sometimes we need to get a little bit of perspective on what are we living. I've heard that said before, that politics is downstream of morality. I say it's downstream of your heart. It's going to reflect us. Are you praying? Are you leading a good example? Are you being someone in the community? Are you involved in a way that glorifies Christ? Are you prideful and boastful and gossiping and slandering? Those are the questions that you have to ask sometimes. One of the biggest prayers to pray is, Father, strengthen their hearts, that they're able to comprehend with all the rest of the saints the length, the depth, the breadth, and the height of the love that Jesus Christ has for us. And that's really what we got out of it. Now, we will continue on to Genesis chapter 20. And in Genesis 20, before we start, we are going to look at the who, what, where, when, why, and how. We always like to do that. Are you currently writing a journal? I know I bring that up a lot, but we are going to talk about it. Are you doing the who, what, where, when, why, and how? Just take a notebook, a piece of paper if you want to. Put whatever the new thing you're going to study, say chapter 21, and write that underneath it. And then continue to make little annotations when those questions are answered. All right, we'll start with the who. We start with the who is involved in this. Abraham, obviously. Sarah, they've gotten their new name changes. Abimelech, the king of Gerar. Now, also brought that up. Abimelech looks to be a title. It appears to be a title. It was used in about 5 different places in the Old Testament. It's like Pharaoh or Herod. God is brought up, Abraham's family, and then the male and female slaves. All right, and then we will continue on and look at which God first. Elohim is the word that's used. It's plural. It's a noun. It's a masculine noun. It also reflects divine majesty and power. This is the divine majesty and power who was the ruling and judging came to Abraham to tell him about the coming destruction. It's pretty important when we think of it like that. Also, I wanted to give you another comment. It's plural noun, and in Hebrew, it requires 3 to be plural. So that gives you a slightly different context of what's going on. Continuing with that, we will look at, we all know Abraham. I'm going to make sure I go back to that and look at it again. We know who Abimelech is, we know who God is in it, and we know about Abraham's family, but also that includes, well, it includes what? Includes male and female slaves. So continuing on, and we will, the reason it includes a lot, so I'll explain to you. Let's do our overview we talked about before. First and second verse about Abraham lying about his wife again. 3 through 7 is God threatens Abimelech's life and he asks for justice. Abraham is rebuked by a heathen king again. Then Abraham makes excuses. Abraham gains wealth from the situation again, and Abraham prays for Abimelech, and they are healed. It's a pretty beautiful overview. It helps a lot to be able to break it down. You can put that at the top of your page before you get started on whatever study it is. Just ask the what question, what actually happened. Do a quick outline. Doesn't have to cover, for sure doesn't have to cover everything. It's an outline. Then let's continue on with the where. You know, we've got maps. We always have maps. So over here, you can see, we start with what it looks like for us now, give you some perspective of how small Israel is. There's Turkey, Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. I forget that Saudi Arabia is so much larger than Egypt, and Iran is about the size of Saudi Arabia, shaped a little differently. And Syria is fairly large too in comparison. Now, on the right side of the slide, you can see a little bit more about the countries. You can see Gaza there on the left side of the slide of the picture by the sea, by the Mediterranean Sea. If you continue east or southeast a little bit is Gerar. And all of that is about just somewhere about. The idea is that it's somewhere about, we'll talk about in a minute, about 40 or 50 miles from Hebron. But this is potentially Sodom and Gomorrah's location. We know that that's not exactly right. We don't know exactly what it really is. And we showed last week a link to an article where they talked about all of the, let's see, how do I want to say it? We talked about that potentially appear on the top right between Ammon and Moab, that it's possible that it was right there in that northeast side of the Salt Sea where there'd been a meteorite and there'd been a lot of melted granite and things like that that's just come out. And it's pretty interesting stuff. We're not going to be able to nail it down. A lot of people said believe it's under the sea right now. Looking at it with another view, a simpler view with Gerar, you can see it on the slightly southeast of Gaza. Excuse me. And you get a better idea of where the Amorites and the Moabites were. So if it did happen, if it was true about that meteorite, it would have been somewhere in between the Amorites and the Moabites on that northeast side. And that's one reason why they do believe that whatever happened was probably the reason why it was a salt sea or a dead sea. And we got into some of those conversations about that. They were used to traveling. It was a few days journey. I'll just say that. We don't know exactly how many. I've read anywhere where they could make 15 to 20 miles on a good day. I don't know that, but it's probably 30 or 40 miles between the two. And 15 to 20 miles, it just depends again on how many children they had, how many animals they took with them. Were they in a hurry? But nonetheless, it was a few days' journey to get to the next location. Now, when did this happen? Well, they was in Mamre about 20 years. We got to get kind of the idea on that timeline. Abraham lived 175 years. At this point, he's been out in the wilderness about 65 years. And we continue on with that. And then we know that let's go. Just that link again, let you see it again. Then Abraham lies about his wife again. So who knows why he moved again? We really don't know. He decided to move on from there, and it tells us from into the region of the Negev and live between Kadesh and Shur. And for a while he stayed in Gerar, and there Abraham said of his wife Sarah, "She is my sister." So Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent for Sarah and took her. Now, what happens? We don't know really why. It's potential that he saw all the smoke and had no idea if Lot lived. There weren't really cell phones to say, "Oh, wait a minute, are you good? Did you make it through it?" We don't know. Was it discouraging? Possibly. It was probably very discouraging to see the people he knew or a whole series of communities or a whole area of the world to be completely destroyed. But we know that he moved down there, and we know that and we'll talk about that in a minute, but we know he made an agreement with Sarah before they left in the first place that would be his sister. Now, but we haven't talked about that. We didn't talk about that a lot last time, but well, let me just go ahead and say it right now. First, Negev is considered south. Remember they talked about going south when it was really north when they were in Egypt, because the Negev is like the south desert. And for a while he stayed there, but why did Abimelech send for her and take her? And that's part of the conversation. And on the next slide, you can see that in Genesis 12, it was almost the same thing. There was a famine in the land. Abram went down to Egypt, he's Abram there, to dwell there, for the famine was severe in the land. And he came to pass when he was close to entering Egypt, that he said to Sarai, his wife, indeed, I know you're a woman of beautiful countenance. Therefore, it'll happen when the Egyptians see you, they'll say, this is his wife, and they will kill me. But you let me live. But they will let you live. Please say, sister, that it may be well with me for your sake, and I may live because of you. So it was that Abram came into Egypt. Then the Egyptians saw the woman, that she was very beautiful. The princess of Pharaoh also saw her and commended her to Pharaoh. And the woman was taken to Pharaoh's house. He treated Abram well for her sake. He had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, female and male servants, female donkeys, and camels. So going back onto that, there's a couple of comments I want to make. He said, it may be well with me for your sake. Now, we forget sometimes a single woman out there in that part of the land with that kind of wealth would have been easily taken over by a Philistine or a king or Abimelech or anyone else that wanted to be a marauder. Likely their agreement came with the idea of mutual protection. Again, so that it may be well with me for your sake. Also, his own sake, he wanted to live. He wanted to live because of her, but he also knew that without him, she would be completely unprotected and vulnerable to anything that went on. As we continue on, we want to know, why did he move back? The why, we talked about that. And why did he lie again? And why did Sarah agree? And why did Abimelech take her? And why is she still so beautiful? All these are some of our questions. We answered some of them. Was, why did he go back to the Negev and then on to Gerar? It's possibly that heartsick. We really don't know. He'd lived in that area before. We don't know how many great ideas about it, but we just talked about why he might have lied again, even though he'd done it before. Now, have you ever done that? I've done that. I've done something wrong. God has solved it, straightened me out, put me on the right path, fixed my feet where they're going straight again, and then I turn around and did it again. Abraham is us. He will make the same mistakes more than once. And I love that. But I also can see some type of pattern in this. He's just come out of the situation. The area is billowing with smoke and destruction, possibly smell. Probably woke up every day and smelled things. And so at one point, you're powerful. You just destroyed another enemy. At another point, you realize the fragility of life. You're taken back off and going south into another area where you know that you are no longer the ruler. You're no longer in peace, but the other place is a little bit close to destruction. It could have help us understand a little bit about why he lied, seeing all that destruction. But why did Abimelech take her? She's an older woman. She's past, you can say what you want to say, but she's past menopause. She can't have children. She's already said that. It's past the time of women. And Abraham is clearly not, she said, could I have pleasure of my man at this age? Indicating that there's possibility, no way that they should be able to even have sex. It's a question. There's speculation done with some of the commentaries that I read that one of the reasons she may have been so beautiful is God had de-aged her so that she could conceive and bear this child. There's no way we really know that. We know she is beautiful, but there's also another component we haven't really talked about. At that point in time, liaisons were made frequently for political reasons. For instance, if you had power and you had a lot of money and you saw someone else with a lot of money and power come in, instead of having a fight, you take one of their family members in and you would say, hey, let's make a liaison. And I've got somebody I'm protecting as a concubine or as in my harem. And you are going to know that I will not destroy you because I've got your family member here. Let's all live together and work together and not fight. You've seen that in England. It was a power consolidation move. But nonetheless, just as a recap, we don't know that that's true, but we know that Abraham did not probably do this out of faith by going back to live there. We know that he lied again because he was afraid for both himself and Sarah. And that's probably why Sarah agreed. And Abimelech took her probably because she was both beautiful and because there were some political points in there that we don't fully understand. And she is probably still so beautiful because on some level God had given her some supernatural ability to stay young, to be able to conceive a child. Now, I'm not telling you that I'm criticizing him in any way. This is just us. It's how we operate, and it's the things that we get ourselves into. Continuing on, and this is where it's, well, yeah, you're right. I heard that in the background. It didn't work the first time. Why would he try it again? He's human, basically. He's just human. We just kind of do that thing, don't we? Now, in the next little bit of verses, he's trying this again. He's done this again, but now God comes to Abimelech, verses 3 through 7. God threatens his life and he asks for justice. So, verses 3 through 7, God came to Abimelech in a dream one night and said to him, "You are as good as dead because of the woman you've taken. She is a married woman." Now, Abimelech had not gone near her, so he said, "Lord, will you destroy an innocent nation, excuse me? Did he not say to me, 'She is my sister'? And didn't she also say, 'He is my brother'? I've done this with a clear conscience and clean hands." Then God said to him in a dream, "Yes, I know you did this with a clear conscience, so I've kept you from sinning against me. That is why I did not let you touch her. Now return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, and he will pray for you and you will live. But if you do not return her, you may be sure that you and all who belong to her will die." Wow. Okay. A lot going on in there, but let's kind of take it down just a little bit at a time. Let's see what this is. The questions we're going to ask is, why did Abimelech, God warn him in a dream in the first place? And then why would he die? Why is this so important? Hence in Genesis 3. And why did God protect him from sinning? And why did Abimelech bring up God as a just God? So those are some of the questions you might jot down in your notebook we were talking about earlier. But it is interesting. He's in the land of Philistines, and God warns Abimelech, and he's a Philistine king who recognized that this is the God of all, and that this God had a power to kill him. Now that's just a regular dream. Why did he use a dream? Yeah, he spoke to a lot of people in dreams back then. Dreams are a very commonplace way of doing it. I'll refer you back to another concept we've referred to before. In the Old Testament, God gave signs and wonders and dreams. And not to say he doesn't do it in the New Testament, but he told us that he showed everyone who Israel was to him and how much it mattered. In the New Testament, it's a little bit different. He said, "We will be known by our love for one another." So we're not supposed to be dependent on signs and wonders to know it's God. And going on, it wasn't a regular dream. He knew that this God could kill him, and he continued. He believed him. And then he pled out. Like, first off, why would he? What did he plead? Let me go back and ask that. He pleaded for justice, just like Abraham asked. Abraham asked for justice when he was asking for Sodom. Now, isn't that interesting? He said, "Hey, he told me I didn't lie. He told me it's my sister." He's stating his case. He's stating his case that she had said it's a sister. Now, I don't know if you've ever been wrong in a situation, you need to go ask God for justice, or you have been wronged and you've been mistreated. And you know that what's happened is that it's just not fair. But also, Jesus is the one that pays the bill. Now, the difference is when something really bad happens, we go to God and say, "We are wrong. Will you forgive us?" And Jesus comes in and says, "They're guilty. I don't need the judgment, but I've already paid the penalty or the fine for that guilt." But it's a natural, healthy part of Christianity also to say, "Lord, this bad thing has happened to me. Give me justice in there." And we talked a little bit about what does justice mean. You have a judge who's rendering the correct verdict based on the facts in front of them. He's judging between the two and rendering the correct decision based on it. Okay? So that's not ever wrong for a Christian to say, "Father, that was not my intent. Show me, let me learn from it, and help me, but but if I was wrong, show me I was wrong, but I wasn't wrong this time. That there's nothing wrong with that. And sometimes I think we're afraid to as Christians. Anyway, why is this so important? I think we forget. This is where the bloodline of Isaac is going to be. This is coming out of Sarah. We don't want any hint whatsoever that it's Abimelech's child. That bloodline cannot be altered. It has to be clear and pristine. So that was one reason. Genesis 3, he gives the promise of that bloodline all the way down to the Messiah. And so you could not, and remember, we talked about that from the time that promise was made. That's been Lucifer's or Satan's number one fight, was to destroy that bloodline and taint it. And there's a lot of things that happen. You look at Cain and Abel, you look at Jacob and Esau, or David, the youngest child. There's just been a lot, Solomon. We can continue on, but the point is, it was important for the bloodline. And the biggest question to me in all of this is, why did God protect Abimelech, an unbeliever, from sinning? Isn't that interesting? We talked about that in the Romans. The whole idea is that people know, whether they admit it or not, they know that there is a God. They know that there is justice out there. That's one of the most fascinating things to me about the poor man and Lazarus. When he saw the rich man, excuse me, he saw Lazarus in Abraham's bosom, and he said, "Can you just give him some water?" But the man was not railing against his judgment. He knew it was a fair judgment. Well, when you recognize that the God Almighty is in front of you, you know who it is. And that's just what happened. So anyway, continuing on with that just kind of solidifies the whole thing to me, is that God is a good God. He is a just God. Sometimes you cry out for mercy, and sometimes you ask for justice. And I think sometimes we are cautious sometimes to ask that question. Now, she's in her 90s and she's going to get pregnant. So again, there's some protection going on here on both sides. All right. David Guzik's commentary was pretty interesting. He just said, "You are a dead man." This was a scary thing to hear from God, even in a dream. But the point had to be made to Abimelech, even though he could truly say he acted in the integrity of his heart and the innocence of his hands. This may seem drastic, but something important was concerned. Suppose Abimelech had taken Sarah and God had not intervened. Two seeds would have been at the door to Sarah's womb, and to this day an element of doubt would cling to the ancestry of our Lord. That was Barnhouse's. Guzik's quoting Barnhouse there. "I know you did this in the integrity of your heart," in Proverbs 21:1, because Abimelech's heart was right in this regard. God kept him from worse sin. God's protecting power can guide even a pagan king, Proverbs 21:1. Now, despite Abraham's failure to really trust God in the situation, God did not abandon him. Now, we sometimes don't have the faith, but we know that God does, and God's faithful, and he does not abandon us. He would not let Abimelech touch Sarah. Her womb was going to bring forth the son of promise, who would eventually bring forth God's Messiah. God would not leave this matter up to man, for he's a prophet and he'll pray for you. Even though Abraham was in sin, he was still a prophet and a man of powerful prayer. God's mercy did not leave Abraham, even though Abraham didn't trust God the way he should. Yeah, I'm going to go back and say Abraham was still a prophet even though he was in sin. We need to be very cautious when someone is a prophet, or like David, a king, and doing what God has called them to do. They make grievous errors sometimes. It's not our job to destroy them or to accuse them before the brethren. It's our job to pray for restoration. Now, if God gives you the right position to go speak with them, that's a different story. But we are not supposed to be tearing down and destroying the people who are walking in the gifts of God. We're pretty good about sitting around and I don't know, just taking pot shots at everybody and being judgmental and self-righteous in it. And that's not the place that we're to hold. We are to respect the office of pastor, preacher, teacher, prophet, evangelist. We're to respect those things. He is still a prophet, even though he's made a mistake. You are still saved, even though you have made mistakes. Continually keeping that in our mind and hearts makes our Christian walk much, much easier. Okay, now chapter 18, verses 23 and 25. In our outline, we said he and Abimelech both appealed to God's justice at a different time. Abraham approaches him In the 18th chapter, this is what I wanted you to hear. Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Will you really sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of the 50 righteous people in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to kill the righteous with the wicked, treating the righteous and the wicked alike. Far be it from you. Will not the judge of all the earth do right? Now, this is where Abraham's appealing to God's justice, almost using the exact same questions and calls that Abimelech has been done. He's asking almost identical the same thing. And it's a very similar prayer. You can see it here, the question we had at the end of that. It's a very similar prayer. Will you not do it? Then continuing, Abraham is rebuked by a heathen king again. Verse 8 through 10. Early the next morning, Abimelech summoned all of his officials. And when he told them what had happened, they were very much afraid. Then Abimelech called Abraham in and said, "What have you done to us? How have I wronged you, that you brought such great guilt upon me and my kingdom? You've done things to me that should have never been done." And Abimelech asked Abraham, "What was your reason for doing this?" Well, he wants to know. Why would you do this? He's just like, if somebody's yelling, why would you do this to me? Or why are you trying to get me killed? He's really asking for his motive. He's asking for an answer, an explanation. You almost got me killed. What were you doing? What were you thinking? I mean, there's a certain amount of resentment or anger, but I heard betrayal in them. You came into my kingdom. I let you, my ruling area. I brought you in. I'm taking care of you and giving your flocks places to graze and take care of you. There's this power agreement. Yeah, she's hot, but it's still a power agreement. We're all working together, but you've lied to me. You've done it under false pretenses. Did Abimelech, a pagan king, have the right to accuse Abraham? Why were they afraid? Why did they believe God could or would destroy them? Well, he asked. So, yeah, I think he had the right to accuse Abraham. He had the right to accuse him because he threatened his life. Now, he doesn't know this God. And then, so why was Abraham afraid that, why were they so afraid? Well, we got so much fear in here. It's just the opposite of faith. We're going to be reminded over and over and over. The fear is the opposite of faith. Yet Abimelech had no doubt that dream was different than a normal dream, and he knew this God could or would destroy them if they had wronged Abraham in any way. That's a pretty impressive question, actually. Why don't you trust? The question is, why don't you trust God? That's really the question. Yeah, I've seen God deliver me from so much, and yet I'll show up with something tomorrow and I'll fail again. That's the other reason we write down in that journal I was telling you about, all the answered prayer, all the prayers we want. So you just write today's date, what Bible verses you're reading today, or what your thoughts you're meditating on. Maybe you're not reading a Bible verse, but the concept of faith, and then you put the faith verses that go in there. But you do the who, what, where, when, why, and how with it, but also somewhere in there, on the back of it, some other page, a separate page, you put down what you're praying for, what you're asking God for, and what God has answered you for in the past. You want to put your praise journal in there as well. You want to be able to look and see what God has done for you and what He's delivered you from. There's going to come a time when you're going to actually need it. And anyway, let's continue on. Again, this is very much like the past time when it had happened, the previous event. The Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. Sarah, this happened in Genesis 12. And Pharaoh called Abram and said, "What is this you've done to me? Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she's my sister? I might have taken her as my wife. Now, therefore, here's your wife. Take her and go your way." So Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. Again, almost identical situation to what had occurred before. If you'd written it down, it makes it easier, is all I can tell you. Makes it easier the next time to recognize, oh, I have the same challenge. Am I going to do it a little bit differently? Now, Abraham replied, "I said to myself, there's surely no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she really is my sister, the daughter of my father, though not of my mother, and she became my wife. And when God had me wander from my father's household, I said to her, 'This is how you can show your love to me. Everywhere we go, say of me, he is my brother.'" Again, we talked about that a little bit, but I think there's some manipulation going on. Abraham believed because they were Philistines, and he thought they were unbelieving, that he couldn't trust them, and he couldn't walk into that situation and trust them. Sometimes we judge other people's hearts without any right to do so. Some of the most moral people you know are not believers. It's hard to see that. That's true. But there are those people out there that have really strong moral, upright beliefs about life. And they're not compliant now. Whether the Holy Spirit's doing something in them, I don't know. But my point is, I don't judge your behavior based on my fear. And that's what Abraham did. He attributed to him characteristics based on his fear. Now, if Abimelech had done something that indicated that his morality system was different and that the social constraints were different, he would not have had a reason to be afraid. But at this point, he did not. He's one of the richest men in the world at this time, even though he'd split with Lot. So he's protecting his goods. He's protecting and taking care of his finances. He doesn't want to lose all that. But continuing on, there's something else just very important about this. Let's talk about why did he ask her to, oh, we talked about that, excuse me. I'm going to continue on to the next slide because we actually talked about that. But he goes on and says, I got this from Barnhouse, surely the fear of God is not in this place. That was Abraham's excuse also. It wasn't just wrong to attribute a characteristic to him that he may and may not have. It was also an excuse. When people make excuses, they have all kinds of justification. The real problem is the fear. And he said, truly, she's my sister. He's still justifying with a half-truth. It's still a lie if it's a half-truth, if you're trying to deceive. And then God called me to wander from my house, my father's house. This was an indirect way of blaming God for the problem. Abraham claimed that God sent him out on a dangerous journey. Now, this is a terrible meaning in the word wander, which Abraham uses. The Hebrew word occurs exactly 50 times in Scripture, and it's never good. It's used of animals going astray, of a drunken man reeling or staggering, of sinful seduction, of a prophet's lies causing the people to err, of the path of a lying heart. 6 other words are translated wander, any one of which Abraham might have used, but he used the worst one available. Just make a couple of comments about that first. When God called me to wander from my father's house, it sounds like he's saying, but this woman you gave me when Adam was in the garden. It was blaming something else. God, it's your fault. It's not my fault. You gave me that woman. You caused me to wander. This is your fault that I'm sinning. This is your fault I'm scared. This is your fault I'm in this problem. And it's pretty, I will say it's pretty arrogant to blame God for your problems. God did call him to leave from his house. He did not call him to wander about in a drunken state or being involved with lies. He used the worst word he could have used because he's blaming God instead of looking at it and saying, oh, my fear is the problem. If I'd gone into it without fear, we would have had a whole different situation. So it's an interesting connection with how we tend to always want to justify what we do and to blame other people. Continuing on, Abraham gains wealth from the situation again, verses 14 through 16. Abimelech brought the sheep and cattle and male and female slaves and gave them to Abraham, and he returned Sarah his wife to him. And Abimelech said, my land is before you. Live wherever you like. To Sarah he said, I'm giving your brother 1,000 shekels of silver. This is to cover the offense against you before all who are with you. They are completely vindicated. Wow. Why does Abimelech give him sheep, cattle, and silver? That's your first question. Why would he do that? And some of you in the class said this, and I agree with it completely. Or I agree that it's part of it for sure. I agree with you completely. This is part of it. I'll say it that way. Why did he give him sheep, cattle, and silver? It was to codify or solidify the agreement that Sarah had not been touched, that everything is returned, and I'm going to pay you back for way I've hurt you. So it's a point of submission also to the position of the prophet. It's saying, no harm, no foul. I'm going to turn this back over, and I was wrong. And it was his way of showing to the world that he hadn't touched her. Now, when he says he gave Sarah her brother silver, do you think there's a little bit of sarcasm in that? It sounds a little bit sarcastic to me. I'm giving your brother silver. But one of the biggest questions I had is, why did Abraham accept the gifts after refusing the king of Sodom? I didn't find anything on it, but what occurred to me when I was thinking about it and praying about it, Abraham accepted money after he left Egypt, but he did not from the king of Sodom. And he is accepting it here. because he didn't want the king of Sodom to feel like he had in any way given, how do I say, made him rich. That's how he said it. Take a shoe latchet. I want you to be able to say you made me rich. Well, and the one with Sodom, it was an action that Abraham had taken by his own strengths and abilities. Yes, God blessed him, but he went and did a physical thing to make it happen. But in the Egypt situation, in this situation, it was completely dependent upon God. So there was no way that Abraham was going to take pride or arrogance that he got silver for lying, or he got gold, he got rich or richer for lying. So it goes kind of interesting with that to me. He accepted those gifts, but it was the only time, or it was the time, there were other times, it was the time that he clearly was not involved with the outcome, in the sense that at this time he's not involved with the outcome, he could not make it happen. Where with the king of Sodom, Abraham had actually had his personal involvement and did work himself. So I would think that there's some works of and faith and grace in this situation. Let's go back to the she was reproved. Look, go back. He can't take credit. He could take credit accidentally for the king of Sodom thing. There's credit. I went in there and fought that with my 318 soldiers, and we really tore everything up, and we got Lot back. But in this, yeah, I lied. So there's no way he could take credit. But continuing on, she was reproved. That is the idea of being set right. It is debated in the things I was reading if she was set right by Abimelech's rebuke, or if she's found to be right because of her humble submission. And this occasion, in a sense, both were true. This is what Guzik was saying. And it looks like that she became submissive to the situation, recognized they were wrong, and stopped what was happening. Excuse me. Then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech and his wives and his slaves, female slaves, so they could have children again. For the Lord had kept all the women in Abimelech's household from conceiving because of Abraham's wife, Sarah. Well, let's look at that. Did Abraham have to pray for him? Why did he pray for him? Yeah, why did he pray for him? Well, and I'm going to go back. Um, he was a prophet. God told him to. He said, this is what you're supposed to do, is pray for him. So yeah, he had to. He had to. He had to pray for him. My question, though, is even more, I would say, interesting or whatever, is why did Abraham have to pray? Yes, he did. And one of the things that he prayed for him to be delivered back and everything to be restored, but he was praying for Abimelech. Let's look at that verse again. We'll go back to it and look at it. He healed Abimelech, his wife, and his female slaves so they could have children again. It's not clear, but it looks like they weren't conceiving. He said the women were not conceiving, and Abimelech was healed. It gives you an indication that they knew that they were infertile. They knew that they could not have children. Now, was that a situation with Abimelech as well? It looks like it. And the women knew they weren't conceiving because of it. So, okay, there you go. That's why he needed healing. It wasn't fair to him. But going on. How does this affect you? How does all of this affect us? Sometimes we forget that is how do I say it? Is your next encounter going to be in a challenge with God? Are you going to be able to hit it with faith? Are you going to know and praise and trust and let go? The idea is don't complicate the situation with lying. Be truthful from the beginning. If you don't make up something, don't make excuses. Don't blame God. Just tell the truth. God, I'm scared. I don't know how to do this. Give me faith. Give me peace. Give me strength. But going on, it's just easier to tell the truth from the beginning. We will end this by prayer. Father, we thank you for today. We ask you to bless us, to give us strength and courage and comfort. Let us leave this place able to worship you and praise you with a full heart. Let us share your word throughout this week with the lost and hurting. Let this word sink into our hearts and change us and transform us. And we thank you, Father, for all the wonderful, wonderful gifts that you've given us and for that precious gift of salvation. In Jesus' mighty name, amen.